Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Coast to Coast Hockey. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into everything to do with the Minnesota Wild. I'm Cameron.
I'm Noel.
And I'm Nick.
Let's get started.
The Minnesota Wild are a very cap-strapped team, so they could only bring in two players this offseason, and that was Patrick Maroon and Jujhar Khaira.
And as Noah mentioned, the cap situation is pretty rough in Minnesota, resulting in very high paid veterans and other players having to leave the team, including Matt Dumba, John Klingberg, Sam Steele, Gustav Nyquist, among others.
Patrick Maroon was brought in from the Lightning via trade, so they traded a seventh-round pick to acquire him. And I think it's kind of funny that the Lightning retained 20% of his $1 million salary, so they're only paying him 800K. If you're going to be hearing us talk about the Wild's cap situation a lot, and I think that really sums it up. They had to get retention on a $1 million player. Patrick Maroon is a depth forward. He led the league in penalty minutes last year, so that's maybe a plus, maybe a negative, depending if you're looking at the fighting that he brings. He's also very physical, and it can be valuable in the power play as well as a net front guy.
The second bigger rival for the team is another depth piece in Jujhar Khaira. This is a guy who I can see fluttering around the fourth line to scratched positions. He's on a 1 year league minimum deal. And last year, as you see there, he put up 14 points in 51 games. He's not really known for his offense, though. This is a guy that is more so trying to be a playmaker while protecting the players on the ice. Another physical presence in the bottom six to beat up on other teams rather than score.
Moving on from the biggest to rivals, which is more literal than normal, to the future outlook. Uh, Decent prospect pool here for the Minnesota Wild. It all starts there with goaltender Jesper Wallstedt, one of the best goaltending prospects in the world. Then they have Marco Rossi, who's struggled at the NHL level so far, but really tore up the AHL. Brock Faber, Liam Ogren, and Danila Yurov, who Nick says should have gone a lot higher than he did in the draft.
You guys can see the draft capital there. They still have both their first and second round picks for the next 3 years, which is always a good sign. They have a pretty decent prospect pool as well, so we'll see if these picks can add to that or if they will be traded.
Now on to the prospect spotlight for the Minnesota Wild. The three prospects that we're going to highlight today are Jesper Wallstedt, Marco Rossi, and Brock Faber. The first prospect of note is Jesper Wallstedt, the goaltender out of Sweden. This is a goaltender who has performed tremendously well against men in Sweden. He put up some really great numbers in large game samples in the past couple of years, and then he made his trek to North America last year to play in the AHL. In his AHL rookie year last year, he put up a 908 and a 268 on a pretty middling Iowa Wild team. So I'm really curious to see if next season he puts up stellar numbers like someone like Dustin Wolf in Calgary. This is a goaltender who I'm very fond of because of his agility and his mobility as a goaltender. He's also very poised in net, so he can handle playing against any age group despite being only 20 years of age. I am excited to see him hold the crease in the future for the Minnesota Wild, but in the meantime, fans should look forward to seeing Filip Gustavsson, another young goaltender, take the reins for now. The second prospect of note is Marco Rossi, and this is a small forward out of the OHL. This is a guy who battled some tough injuries to get to where he is today. Yeah, he battled myocarditis, which is an inflammation of the heart because of COVID-19 in the 2020-2021 season, which took him out that whole year practically. But before then, he had put up 120 points in only 56 OHL games with the Ottawa 67s, one of the top teams in the league. So this is a guy who has dynamic offensive potential, but we just have not seen it yet. We have seen it in the AHL, as you can see there with the split numbers. He put up 16 goals and 35 assists for 51 points in 53 games in his second AHL season. But in the NHL, he has sort of far been non-existent offensively. So I look to see if maybe a few more NHL games will make him more comfortable and get back up to speed from what was a crazy injury 2 years ago with the myocarditis. It's glad to see that he's doing well. The third prospect of note is Brock Faber, and this is a defenseman out of college in the NCAA with the University of Minnesota, which is kind of great to see that he is actually from Minnesota, playing for the Minnesota Wild, while also playing for the University of Minnesota. This year, he will be playing in the NHL with Minnesota Wild, and as you can see last year, he put up some very good points totals for 38 games in the NCAA. He's a former second round pick from 2020, and he's quite the agile defender, as we saw in the playoffs last year, where he played 2 regular season NHL games after college ended, and then played 6 playoff games and performed pretty well in pretty tough minutes against some tough teams. So I'm looking forward to seeing all 3 of these guys in the Minnesota Wild lineup in the future, most notably Marco Rossi this season, as well as Brock Faber, and hopefully Jesper Wallstedt soon enough.
Moving on to the projected lineup for the Minnesota Wild, pretty solid top 6 that they have here. With Kirill Kaprizov and Matt Zuccarello on the wings on that first line, you really couldn't ask for a better duo. They've been electric together and really have developed some great chemistry over the past couple of years. Ryan Hartman's probably not the guy you want centering your top line, but he'll make do for now with some really great wingers on his by his side. So that second line there has merging, I would say, superstar Matthew Boldy, as well as Joel Eriksson Ek, who is one of the best defensive centers in the NHL and is still continuing to get better on the offensive side of the puck every season. And then you have Marcus Johansson on the right wing. Probably not a guy you'd like to see in your top 6 if possible, probably more suited for a third line, but he'll make do for now on what is a really good line otherwise. And then on the third line, we have Marcus Foligno, Marco Rossi, and Frederick Gaudreau. One thing of note here is if Marco Rossi is going to be an everyday NHL player, it's really good to have a guy like Marcus Foligno flanking him on the wing who can kind of protect him from some of the heavy hitters or guys who are going to go out there and try to target a smaller player in Marco Rossi. And one other thing to note there is that Frederick Gaudreau at certain points last year was playing as high as the first line center. So really good to have a guy that versatile who can move up and down the lineup and play a variety of positions. As for the fourth line, we have recent acquisition Patrick Maroon, who, as Noel said, led the league in penalty minutes last year, and he's going to throw a bunch of hits all the time. Don't have the specific number, but he's known for his physicality and also a 3-time Stanley Cup champion, so a good guy to bring in there. Then you have Connor Dewar and Brandon Duhamel, as well as Jujihar Kara and Nick Patan as extras. So a pretty physical fourth line, as well as a physical extra in Kara who can come in and probably play that center.
Onto the projected defensive pairs for the Minnesota Wild. The first defensive pair consists of Jacob Middleton and Jared Spurgeon, the captain of the team and the longtime Minnesota Wild member. Jared Spurgeon is arguably one of the best defensive defensemen in the league and provides a bit of offense, but Jacob Middleton also provides some great defense, in my opinion, with his physicality and puck moving. So I do think this will be a great top pair for any team going into the playoffs. You've got Jonas Brodin and Kalen Addison. I still think Kalen Addison has a chance to become a top 4 defenseman in this league. Despite being slotted in this top 4 currently, he may not be considered by many to be a top 4 defenseman. He's still kind of young, has been around a bit. He just got from Pittsburgh, obviously, over to Minnesota. So I do think that Kalen Addison has a chance to become what he was put out to be, which would be like an offensive-minded, skilled defenseman. But for now, he'll be slotted alongside Jonas Brodin, which is the biggest safety net you could possibly ask for, with one of the best defensive defensemen in the league as well in Jonas Brodin. So good for Kalen Addison to have that opportunity to play alongside someone he can trust. And on the third pair, we've got John Merrill and Alex Goligoski, 2 veterans who have possibly lost a bit of touch over the past couple of years. Not their form from their 20s, but they're still decent defensemen. And Brock Faber, I could see definitely slotting into one of those parts when Goligoski or Merrill needs a break. And Brock Faber has shown some promise already just out of college, so maybe he gets a few games in throughout the season.
Gustavsson was acquired via trade with the Ottawa Senators, and Minnesota sent over veteran goalie Cam Talbot. And last year was really kind of a question who would be the starting goalie between Gustavsson and Marc-Andre Fleury. Obviously, Marc-Andre Fleury is a legend of the game, but by the end of the season and going into the playoffs, it was clear that Gustavsson was the guy. And I really got to commend that trade. It's a great asset management to send the veteran goalie over for a guy that is your starter. And Gustavsson is still a young goal and he's projected to be even better this year. So that's a very nice piece in starting goal. And you still have the legend Marc-Andre Fleury as your backup. So that's great goaltending depth between the two of them will be a nice tandem. And then having Jesper Wallstedt behind them is also great. Any barring injury, he probably will be in the AHL, as Nick was saying, but he's a really intriguing player that you can have to call up if any one of these guys goes down with injury. So a great goaltending core here for the Minnesota Wild.
Moving on from our projected lineups to our storylines surrounding the Minnesota Wild in 2023 and 24. So the first one here is the fact that 3 of really the core guys on this team who've been big contributors each in their own way over the past couple seasons are coming up as UFAs. So Ryan Hartman's deal is coming up. He currently makes 1.7 million. Matt Zuccarello's deal is also coming up. He currently makes 6 million. As is Marcus Foligno's deal, he currently makes 3.1 million. So all those guys are going to expire at the end of the season. For some context as to their recent performance, Hartman is 29 years old and put up 37 points in 59 games last year. The season before that, he kind of exploded for 65 points, which is, I believe, his career high, and maybe a bit of an anomaly, but he was playing really high up in the lineup, which he's projected to again. Zuccarello is quite a bit older at 36 and put up 67 points in last season and put up 79 the year before. So just about a point per game, if not a point per game. And then Foligno last season, he put up 237 hits, which is what he's more known for, is more the physical aspect of the game and kind of sticking up for his teammates, great leadership. But he also had 21 points, so not a unproductive player from the offensive side. So I guess the question is here, there's such a cap strap team with that approximately $14 million in dead cap that I'm sure we'll talk about with Ryan Suter and Zach Parise. But uh, which of these three guys would you guys prioritize if you're GM Bill Guerin?
For me, I think they should prioritize Matt Zuccarello. We've seen the chemistry that he's built with Kirill Kaprizov. And when you have two dynamic wingers like that, it's less important the centerman that you have. I mean, Ryan Hartman's a solid player, but he's by no means one of the top first line centers in the league and can be replaced by someone maybe cheaper. Obviously, it'll be a downgrade, but I think losing Zuccarello would be a much bigger loss.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's interesting because Zuccarello is an aging player. He's already 36. So I
Mm.
consider him similar to Joe Pavelski as sort of like he's made his mark on the league. He's earned over $48 million dollars in his career. I think now is the time for him to take that 1 year deal that helps the team out cap wise, possibly, where Joe Pavelski took a 1 year, $3.5 million deal with Dallas despite putting up almost a point a game the year before. I think if Zuccarello does something similar, the Minnesota Wild can be competitive with a few extra dollars to spend on somebody else. I can expect Ryan Hartman to go probably in the offseason because of his production. It's just unsubstantiated to really want to pay for that guy when you don't know what he's going to give you each year. He give you 65 points 1 year, he can give you 30 points the next year. He's been into the league late, therefore it's possible that he leaves the league early. So it's gonna be unlikely for him to stick in Minnesota because of their cap situation as well. He might want to raise because there are very few people that can put up 65 points, but he was alongside the likes of Kaprizov and others. So overall, and the last person, Marcus Foligno, actually would like to point out that Ryan Reeves leaving the team and signing that bigger deal with the Maple Leafs does raise some red flags for the Minnesota Wild and being able to keep such an asset because there are very few players in the league that do the role of Marcus Foligno. So maybe he's going to command a lot of money like Ryan Reeves did to get what he got in Toronto. So maybe that causes the Minnesota Wild to have to let both Hartman and Foligno go.
Yeah, for me, what worries me is simply Zuccarello's age and the fact that he's produced so well over the past couple of years that he could, in all honesty, ask for a raise this offseason. And if he does that, I think you have to let him go because you just simply don't have the cap space to pay him $7 million or around that neighborhood. But if he wants to come back around $5 million for a year or two, I think that's a no brainer. And to keep him with Kaprizov is just, like I said, a no brainer. As for Ryan Hartman, I completely agree. This is a guy who's probably going to be probably going to get market value between $3 and $4 million in the open market, I'd say. If a team's really willing to pay, he could even get as high as like $4.5 million, comparable to Michael Bunting. So this is a guy who is probably going to outprice himself out of Minnesota, but the cap is projected to go up $4 million. But at the end of the day, you have to decide: do you want to spend that $4 million on Ryan Hartman, or would you rather use his money, maybe the money you get from Alex Goligoski leaving, and couple that all together and get a more bona fide first line center in the $7 to $8 million range? That would probably make a lot more sense, as we'll get into in a minute. And Marcus Foligno is a guy I just have a hard time seeing leaving. It seems like he's a absolute just ingrained almost in the team at this point, and I wouldn't be surprised if he took a bit of a discount to stay in Minnesota. He's just a natural leader like his brother is, and so I wouldn't be surprised if he stays a deal around 2.5 million with a little bit more term, kind of like similar to what Reeves did, kind of compensate them with term as opposed to cap.
Yeah, I did overlook Zuccarello's age there a bit, but I do think he's such a smart player. His game is aging like fine wine. So I'm not too worried about a regression this year. Maybe in the next 2 seasons, we can see a big dip in his production.
Yeah, he's a very
Getting
low
tough right
risk
now.
player. So he's a
Mm,
guy that, he picks his moments. He doesn't overextend. It helps that he's such a small frame, but he's not a guy that's going to get injured all the time because, well, he has had some injuries in the past, but it's more so to do with his feet rather than his upper body. So I think he's someone that can sort of sustain a whole season again. And something I like to point out is that if Marco Rossi proves to be that bona fide centerman that he's supposed to be, then maybe that influences the decision of the Minnesota Wild to part ways with Ryan Hartman.
It also, with Zuccarello, it just one thing that interests me is if they're not able to retain him, I really wouldn't mind seeing Matt Boldy and Kirill Kaprizov on the same line at some point. I think it would make a lot of sense to have a. I know they are slotted in at the same wing, but to have a guy like Kaprizov, who's one of the league's best playmakers, and then Boldy, who can really put the puck in the back of the net, I think it would be interesting dynamic that they should at least experiment with, and maybe it would make Zuccarello obsolete at the end of the day.
Yeah, Boldy's someone that can keep up with Kaprizov's intentions. Kaprizov's a very like wide moving, energetic winger. So someone like Boldy to read off of that is probably perfect for the future. Zuccarello for the present is also pretty nice to see that he is able to read off those passes, read off the skating, keep up with Kaprizov on the rush, for example, and among other things that Zuccarello has been very known for the past couple of years.
yeah, Boldy and Kaprizov did have some minutes together last year, so it's been done before. Interesting to keep an eye on that in the future.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess the consensus here is probably looking to keep Foligno for sure. Zuccarello probably if the price is right, as well as the term is really important there. And Hartman's likely not going to be a Minnesota Wild next season. So unless he's coming in at a lower AAV, then he probably will get an open market. But uh, be interesting to see what unfolds there because, like I said, these are three guys that are really integral to what Minnesota's done the past couple of years. So be an interesting storyline to watch unfold. As for our second storyline, it's just wondering whether it's time for Marc-Andre Fleury to hang up the pads. So just going over some of his stats from the last couple of years. In 2023, he put up a 908 save percentage and a 285 goals against. So not the best numbers for a guy who's been elite for the majority of his career. He had very similar numbers the year before, a 908 and a 2.9 goals against. Of note there is he started out the year with the absolutely dreadful Chicago Blackhawks, so that's obviously going to depress those numbers a bit. But the year before, he had a 928 and a 1.98 goals against average and won the Vezina Trophy. So clearly he's not far from being elite goaltender in the NHL, but it's just a very stark regression that's happening pretty quickly here. So, what's his? If you have it up, Nick, what's his age exactly? Is he 38 years old?
Correct. He's 38 years old in
Yeah,
the last year
38.
of that $3.5 million a year
Yeah.
deal.
So it'd be interesting to see whether or not he'll retire. And I definitely think Minnesota is probably eager to get Jesper Wallstedt in the crease in the NHL as well.
Yeah, saying that he's in the last year of his deal, I wonder if Minnesota would even want to re-sign him if Wallstedt proves that he's like too good for the AHL this year. And retiring, especially for someone with such a long career as Flair, would be such an emotional decision for him to make. We can't even begin to like speculate what would be going on in his head during that time. So I don't really have a comment on whether he will retire or not. I'm just hoping for a good season from him.
Yeah, he's someone that has been around for forever and feels like he can still play forever. He seems like one of those like healthy enough like long-term goaltenders that just will never quit and will play every year, including deep into the playoffs for many years. So he has very short off seasons for a goaltender, but he still makes it work every year. So I'm really proud that he's had such a career like this with many different teams. Like obviously, it would have been nice to see him like a career Penguin, in my opinion, by the end of his tenure and retire as a Penguin. Maybe that happens at the end, but now with his success in Vegas, Chicago, and Minnesota, respectively, I think that it's probably time for him to move on to family life at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if he retires at any point in the next year, couple of years. But this is also a guy I could see playing until he's 40. And like you said, Nick, I was actually going to bring it up. I would not be surprised if this summer he goes back to Pittsburgh as their backup behind Tristan Jarry there, because Nedeljkovic, as we went through, is really unestablished as an NHL netminder at this point. So maybe he goes back and finishes his career off in his old stomping grounds and has a couple more cracks at it with Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin and Chris Letang.
That'd be nice to see for sure.
Be an unbelievable story. But yeah, I guess only time will tell. He's definitely getting to the age where wouldn't be shocked if he retires, but definitely think he still has a couple years left if he so desires. But um, moving on to our final storyline. So as we kind of alluded to during the lineup segment, Ryan Hartman's currently slotted in as that first line center. A guy like Frederick Gaudreau was often the first line center last year. So was Sam Steele. So kind of just rotating out top nine forwards, I would say. Those are all good top nine forwards, but not first line centers. So I think this is a team that, despite their cap issues, is going to really be looking to pursue a first line center to pair with Kaprizov, as they should be doing. Maybe they had a hope that Marco Rossi would be that guy at this point in his career, but due to things outside of his control, he just hasn't been able to get there at this point. So he's going to need a couple more years at least. So in terms of players that I can think of that would interest me if I'm Bill Guerin, I'd be looking at guys like Mark Scheifele, Elias Lindholm, Evgeny Kuznetsov, Logan Couture, and Sean Couturier. Those are all guys that are on teams that haven't been overly successful in the past couple of years, and for one reason or another could find themselves on the way out.
Yeah, this team would be hard pressed to sign a big name center in free agency just with their cap situation. One name you mentioned was Mark Scheifele, and he this season is only carrying around a $6 million cap hit. So that's someone they could look to add at the deadline with some retained salary. They could get him fairly cheap. I don't know if Winnipeg would even want to trade if they're trying to compete for a playoff spot, or if they'd want to even trade to someone in their division and a division rival. So it's kind of a tough situation if you're looking to upgrade from Ryan Hartman, or if Ryan Hartman leads in free agency is going to be just when you're so up against the cap, you don't have a lot of maneuverability.
Yeah, and someone that would be a dream for the Minnesota Wild that fits their identity absolutely correctly is Sean Couturier. This is multiple Selke nominated player with the pedigree of a defensive first line center that any team would love in the playoffs. Unfortunately, he's on Philadelphia, and they are not going to make the playoffs this year. Hot take. With that being said, he does have a no movement clause for the first 7 years of his 8-year deal, which he's in year 2 coming into this year of that. So therefore, it is very, very unlikely that he'll waive that at this time. But maybe if it turns into a tire fire over there in Philadelphia, maybe he decides that he wants out in the next couple of years. But for this year specifically, it is unlikely that Sean Couturier will be a Minnesota Wild player, but that would be someone that I'm sure the Wild fans would love to have as their top line center as the defensive side to the Kaprizovs and the Zuccarellas, respectively.
Yeah, with pretty much any of these players, I think they're probably going to be looking at the need for retention. To me, with all of them, it depends on how their teams are doing at the deadline. Specifically Scheifele and Lindholm, especially like Couturier, we don't expect the Flyers to be good. Couture, we don't expect the Sharks to be good. But with the Capitals, the Flames, and the Jets, it really depends on how those teams are doing. So Lindholm, it has probably the lowest cap hit of all the guys here. I believe it's around 4.5 million or something like that. So if Calgary's doing really poorly throughout the season, this is a guy they could get at 50% retention at around $2 million. So that would make a lot of sense.
Is Lindholm's cap actually 4 million? What a
Yeah.
steal!
Yeah, man. He's on one of the most underpaid contracts in the NHL right now, and that's why he's looking for such an increase in salary to be possibly paid more than Bo Horvat, because it's kind of like with William Nylander, right? They're looking for almost retribution for the years of missed earnings.
Keep in mind, he signed it in 2018 before most of these breakouts. That was just after he got traded from Carolina.
Right.
Calgary signed him to that 6-year, 4.85 per year. And then after that, he soon broke out to be the center that we know him to be today.
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about him is with 50% retention, this is a bona fide first line center that teams could get for $2 million. That's incredibly valuable. So anyways, those are the three names I think I'd really highlight there. But all of those players would make a lot of sense here. Obviously, Evgeny Kuznetsov's a massive risk based on recent performance, but it'd be really interesting to see any of these guys play with Kirill Kaprizov because they desperately need a number one center to hold that line down and play between Zuccarello and Kaprizov. So we'll have to see if Bill Guerin's able to do anything. Obviously, he's kind of backed into a corner with their cap situation, but uh, they've been able to make some moves in the past, so we'll have to see where it goes. Moving on from our storylines to a broad overview for the Minnesota Wild's offseason and upcoming season. We're going to go through some grades for the performance off the ice and on the ice. So the offseason grade is going to be a B minus. Bill Guerin, as we've said many times, is completely limited by the circumstances he finds himself in with $14 million of dead cap. So he really wasn't able to do a lot, but it is tough as a team that has some really young and up and coming players to appear that you've moved sideways instead of up coming out of the offseason. So really tough to give them more than a B minus there. Don't mind the Maroon or Kara additions, but just not really going to change anything for this team next season. In terms of the offensive strength, it's going to be a B. Really like the top six. It's pretty good, minus that first line center spot. But the depth is just not really there in terms of impact players throughout the lineup. In terms of the defense, it's going to be a B. A really good defensive core with two, as Nick said, two of the best defensive defensemen in the NHL with Spurgeon and Brodin. But Kalen Addison is an absolute liability on defense. Great offensive player, but not a good defensive player at this point in his career. So if he's able to develop into a more well-rounded player, this mark will definitely go up. But Goligoski's losing the wheels. I like John Merrill, but it's tough to give them a higher grade when some of their defensemen aren't really known to be good defensemen. And then goaltending strength is going to be an A minus. They got incredible depth in this position, and Gustavsson might be a little unproven, but he is. I believe he's going to have another breakout year after posting, I believe, above a 930 last season, which is just incredible and not in a small sample size either. So I expect him to take another step. As you said, Noel, that's got to be one of the better trades of the past couple of years to buy low on him and ship out Talbot, who's now no longer in Ottawa and didn't do well there either. And they've kind of hedged their bets with a veteran goaltender behind a young, inexperienced goaltender with Marc-Andre Fleury. As for the future outlook, going to be a B plus. They've got a solid prospect pool. Kaprizov isn't too old. Eriksson X, same thing. So they've got some good younger players who aren't 30 yet, getting there, but aren't 30 yet. But they've got a pretty good prospect pool. So the future is bright for the Minnesota Wild.
An exciting time here at Coast to Coast Hockey. We have our first top divisional team. We have the Minnesota Wild projected to finish third in the Central Division, so making the playoffs. And this is kind of where Minnesota has been for like a lot of recent memory. They've been good enough to make the playoffs, but they are not truly Stanley Cup contenders. They'll probably most likely just lose in the first round again. They seem to kind of have a nice streak of that going. And also, I want to say, where would this team be without Kirill Kaprizov? He's really the main guy on this roster. So looking for him to have another big season. And also, if they didn't have all that dead cap space, this team would be moving way up these projections. So they're close to being there, but they're just limited by dead cap space pretty much.
Moving on from our overview to take a look at the individual rankings. So Nick had them finishing 11th and making the playoffs. Noel had them finishing 11th as well and also in the playoffs. I had them 13th and making the playoffs. So an aggregate ranking of 12 with a playoff berth as one of the top three teams in the Central Division. Not much difference here, so not really anything to debate. For all the reasons we've said, this is going to be a very similar team to last year. They've got some really good defensive defensemen, good goaltending depth, and a couple stud forwards.
Yeah,
I'm expecting a first round loss.
it's
pretty much
unfortunate.
where I peg them.
I do really applaud the work they've done with the cap situation that they are in. They have their two goaltenders at $7 million in total. They've got their defense at $20 million, but they've got guys like Spurgeon and Brodin at 7.5 and $6 million respectively. And they've also got Kirill Kaprizov at $9 million rather than like an 11 or a 12. So these are marginal but still worthwhile moves that have helped them in the long run. Despite the $15 million dead cap from the Zach Parise and Ryan Suter buyouts for the next 2 years. That's a very big hurdle to overcome, but they've still made it work, and they're still a playoff team despite all that.
This is really a team to me that's one or two moves away from being a team that can really make some noise in the playoffs. It really all comes down to that number one center position, and if they're able to address that at the deadline, this is a team that I wouldn't want to match up against in the playoffs personally. So definitely room for improvement here if Bill Guerin is able to manage the roster correctly, which he has a track record of doing thus far. So no hesitancy there to expect them to regress this season. So that's going to do it for this video, guys. Thanks so much for watching. We hope you're enjoying the series so far, and we hope to see you guys in the next one. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.